The village of St. Mary Mead had seen many winter mornings, but few quite so crystalline as this one. December had arrived with an artist's precision, painting every hedge and gatepost with frost so delicate it seemed to have been applied with a fairy's brush. The bare branches of the elm trees stood etched against a pearl-grey sky, and the cottage gardens lay dormant beneath their winter quilts, waiting patiently for spring's eventual return. Miss Jane Marple stood at her sitting-room window, watching the early preparations at Rosewood House across the village green. Even at this distance, she could see the bustle of activity as servants hurried back and forth, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Mrs. Helena Fortescue was hosting her annual Christmas rose exhibition today, and the entire village had been invited to view her famous collection of hellebores, which bloomed magnificently despite, or perhaps because of, the harsh December weather. "Such dedication to beauty in the depth of winter," Miss Marple murmured to herself, adjusting her woolen shawl, "though I've always found that the most beautiful flowers often grow in the most troubled soil." Her housekeeper, Mrs. Knight, appeared with a tea tray, her cheeks pink from the kitchen warmth. "Will you be attending Mrs. Fortescue's exhibition today, Miss Marple? Half the village is talking of nothing else." "Oh yes, my dear. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled with gentle interest. "Mrs. Fortescue has worked so hard to establish herself since she inherited Rosewood House, and her Christmas roses are said to be quite extraordinary." Indeed, Helena Fortescue had become something of a local celebrity since moving to St. Mary Mead 3 years prior. A widow in her early 50s, she had inherited the grand Rosewood House from a distant relative and had immediately set about transforming its neglected gardens into showcases of horticultural excellence. Her specialty was the cultivation of Christmas roses, hellebores that bloomed in pristine white and pale pink even in the harshest winter conditions. The varieties she grew were rare and valuable, and her expertise had earned her recognition in gardening circles far beyond their quiet village. The social landscape. By 2 o'clock, Miss Marple had made her way to Rosewood House, where she found the village's social elite gathered in the conservatory, warming themselves with mulled wine before venturing into the garden proper. The atmosphere buzzed with the particular energy that accompanies any gathering where people are simultaneously trying to enjoy themselves and position themselves advantageously within the local hierarchy. Mrs. Fortescue moved through her guests with practiced grace, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her burgundy wool dress both elegant and practical for the outdoor exhibition. She was a handsome woman with intelligent dark eyes and the sort of commanding presence that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to. As she passed, Miss Marple noticed how different people reacted to their hostess. Some with genuine warmth, others with the careful deference one shows to someone whose favor might prove useful. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you." Mrs. Fortescue approached with a warm smile. "I do hope you'll find the exhibition interesting. The roses are at their absolute peak just now, despite this dreadful cold." "I'm sure they'll be magnificent, my dear. You've worked so hard on them." Miss Marple's gentle smile masked her keen observation of the slight tension around Mrs. Fortescue's eyes. "Though I imagine gardening on this scale requires considerable help." "Oh yes, I couldn't manage without my team. David Morrison, my head gardener, is absolutely indispensable, and my nephew Charles has been such a help with the business side of things." Mrs. Fortescue's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "Family can be such a blessing, can't it?" Miss Marple murmured agreement, while noting the carefully controlled tone in which family had been mentioned. She had learned, long ago, that when people spoke of family as a blessing in precisely that tone, there were usually complications lurking beneath the surface. The players assemble. As the guests prepared to venture into the garden, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe the various personalities gathered for the occasion. Near the conservatory entrance stood Charles Fortescue, Helena's nephew, a man in his early 30s with the sort of weak, handsome face that suggested charm had always served him better than character. He was engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Haydock, though his attention seemed divided, his gaze frequently drifting toward his aunt, with an expression Miss Marple found difficult to read. "Charles has been staying at Rosewood House for several months now," confided Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow with the enthusiasm of someone who had gossip to share. "Helping Helena with her business affairs, supposedly, though some say he's been rather more of a drain than a help. His mother, Helena's sister, left him quite well off, but apparently he's managed to get through most of it rather quickly." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Young men can be careless with money, can't they? Especially when they've never had to earn it themselves." Near the garden doors, she noticed a striking couple engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation. The woman was petite and dark-haired, with the sort of nervous energy that suggested she was perpetually on edge. Her companion was a tall, weathered man in his 40s, with the calloused hands and sun-weathered face of someone who worked outdoors. "That's David Morrison, the head gardener," Mrs. Price continued, following Miss Marple's gaze. "And his wife, Sarah. She helps with the greenhouse work and the business correspondence. They've been with Helena since she first arrived, and she depends on them enormously, though there have been whispers lately." "Whispers?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Well, you know how people talk. Some say Helena has become rather too dependent on David's expertise, if you know what I mean. And Sarah Morrison doesn't look like a woman who would take kindly to that sort of attention being paid to her husband." Miss Marple observed the Morrisons more closely. David Morrison stood with the confident bearing of a man who knew his worth, while his wife's posture suggested someone braced for disappointment. There was a brittleness to Sarah Morrison's smile as she responded to something her husband said, and Miss Marple recognized the particular tension that comes from trying to hold together something that may already be broken. Into the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Fortescue called out, her voice carrying easily across the conservatory. "Shall we venture out to see the stars of our show? I promise the Christmas roses are worth a bit of cold." The group bundled into coats and scarves and followed their hostess through the French doors into the garden proper. The cold struck immediately, sharp and clean, turning breath into visible puffs and making everyone draw their wraps more tightly around themselves. Rosewood House's garden was laid out in the formal English style, with geometric beds bordered by low boxwood hedges and connected by gravel paths that crunched satisfyingly underfoot. But it was the far corner of the garden that drew everyone's attention, a sunken area where the famous Christmas roses grew in magnificent profusion. The hellebores were indeed spectacular. Despite the frost that glittered on every other surface, these remarkable flowers bloomed in defiant beauty, their white and pale pink petals seeming to glow with their own inner light. They had been arranged in carefully planned drifts, creating rivers of color that flowed between the geometric beds with artistic precision. "Absolutely magnificent, Helena," exclaimed Colonel Bantry, his breath forming clouds as he spoke. "Never seen anything like it. How on earth do you manage it in this weather?" Mrs. Fortescue beamed with pride. "It's all in the breeding and the positioning, Colonel. These particular varieties have been selected for their cold tolerance, and David has created the perfect microclimate for them in this sheltered corner." David Morrison stepped forward, his professional pride evident. "The key is in the soil preparation and drainage, sir. Christmas roses don't mind the cold, but they won't tolerate wet feet. We've spent 2 years getting the conditions exactly right." Miss Marple found herself standing near the edge of the sunken garden, admiring not just the flowers, but the obvious skill and dedication that had created this winter wonderland. She was particularly drawn to a section where the largest and most perfect blooms grew in a circular pattern around an old stone bird bath that served as a focal point. "They're like stars fallen to earth, aren't they?" said a voice beside her. Miss Marple turned to see a young woman she didn't immediately recognize. Perhaps 25, with auburn hair and green eyes that held an unusual intensity. She was well-dressed, but not expensively so, and there was something about her manner that suggested she was not entirely comfortable in this social setting. "Indeed they are, my dear. Are you visiting our village?" "I'm Margaret Sims. I work for Pemberton and Associates. They're Mrs. Fortescue's business advisors in London. I've come down to discuss some matters regarding the commercial expansion of her horticultural enterprises." The young woman's tone was carefully professional, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension. "How interesting. Mrs. Fortescue has certainly built something remarkable here." Margaret Sims glanced around the garden, then leaned slightly closer to Miss Marple. "Yes, she has, though I'm afraid there may be some complications regarding the future of the enterprise. Financial matters can be so complex, especially when family is involved." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion near the main flower bed drew everyone's attention. Charles Fortescue had apparently stumbled on the frost-slicked path and had caught himself by grabbing onto David Morrison's arm, nearly pulling the gardener down with him. "Careful there, Charles," Mrs. Fortescue called out, her voice sharp with annoyance. "David, are you all right?" "Fine, Mrs. Fortescue," Morrison replied, steadying himself. But Miss Marple noticed the look he gave Charles Fortescue, a look that contained considerably more hostility than such a minor incident would warrant. Charles laughed it off with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to smoothing over awkward moments. "Sorry, old man, these paths are treacherous. Perhaps we should have brought ice skates." The group laughed politely, but Miss Marple sensed undercurrents of tension that had nothing to do with slippery pathways. She watched as Sarah Morrison moved quickly to her husband's side, her face tight with concern that seemed disproportionate to the minor incident. The afternoon unfolds. For the next hour, the guests wandered through the garden, admiring the various displays and warming themselves periodically in the conservatory with hot beverages and small cakes. Miss Marple found herself in several interesting conversations, each of which added another piece to the complex social puzzle that was Rosewood House. Dr. Haydock mentioned that Mrs. Fortescue had been consulting him about stress-related symptoms lately. Nothing serious, you understand, but she's been rather wound up about business matters. Success can be as stressful as failure, sometimes more so. Mrs. Bantry confided that she'd heard Charles Fortescue had been asking around the village about property values. Odd thing for a nephew to be inquiring about, don't you think? Unless he's planning to settle here permanently. The vicar's wife mentioned that Sarah Morrison had been attending church more frequently lately, and always alone. She has the look of a woman seeking guidance, if you know what I mean. Sometimes people pray hardest when they're facing difficult decisions. As the afternoon light began to fade, Mrs. Fortescue gathered her guests for a final viewing of the prize specimens in the circular bed around the stone bird bath. "These are my crown jewels," she announced proudly. "The Helena's Pride variety. I developed them myself through careful crossbreeding. They're completely unique." The group clustered around the display, exclaiming over the perfect blooms that seemed to glow in the gathering dusk. Miss Marple noticed that Margaret Sims hung back slightly, checking her watch with the air of someone who had other pressing matters to attend to. "I'm afraid I really must be getting back to London," Margaret announced. "Mrs. Fortescue, could we perhaps have that private conversation we discussed? It really can't wait much longer." Mrs. Fortescue's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, my dear. Why don't we step into my study? The rest of you, please continue to enjoy the garden. David will be happy to answer any questions about the cultivation techniques." The two women walked back toward the house, their heads bent together in conversation that appeared to grow more intense with each step. Miss Marple watched them go, noting the rigid set of Mrs. Fortescue's shoulders and the determined stride of her companion. The discovery. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when Charles Fortescue came hurrying back from the house, his face pale and his usual easy manner completely absent. "Dr. Haydock," he called out, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Dr. Haydock, you must come quickly." The doctor immediately abandoned his examination of a particularly fine hellebore and hurried toward Charles. "What is it, my boy? What's wrong?" "It's Aunt Helena. I found her in the study. She's not moving, and there's—" Charles swallowed hard. "There's blood." The remaining guests fell silent, their festive chatter dying away as the implications of Charles' words sank in. Dr. Haydock was already striding toward the house, his medical bag in hand. "Everyone please remain here," he called over his shoulder. "Don't disturb anything in the house until I've had a chance to examine the situation." But Miss Marple had already begun moving toward Rosemont House, her keen mind cataloguing everything she had observed during the afternoon. The tensions, the whispered conversations, the careful positioning of various players in this domestic drama. As she walked, she noticed something that made her pause. There, scattered on the gravel path leading to the house, were several pristine white petals from a Christmas rose. They formed a trail of sorts, as if someone had carried the flowers and dropped petals as they walked. But the nearest hellebore bed was yards away, and the petals looked too fresh and perfect to have been blown by the wind. Miss Marple bent carefully to examine one of the fallen petals. It was unbruised, clearly recently picked, and there was something dark staining one edge, something that looked suspiciously like blood. "Oh dear," she murmured to herself, straightening slowly. "I'm afraid someone has been very clever indeed, and very, very cruel." Behind her, the Christmas roses continued to bloom in their serene beauty, unmarked by the violence that had shattered the peaceful winter afternoon. But Miss Marple knew, with the certainty born of long experience with human nature, that their pristine petals would soon tell a story of murder most foul. The game, as they say, was afoot. The drawing-room at Rosemont House, usually a haven of floral chintz and polished mahogany, had become a crucible for fear and speculation. Guests, herded in by a parlor maid at Dr. Haydock's instruction, clustered on sofas and armchairs, voices hushed to a nervous murmur. Outside, darkness pressed against the tall windows, the winter wind rattling panes and making the lamplight flicker as if in sympathy with the collective unease. Dr. Haydock entered with heavy steps, his joviality replaced by the gravity of his profession. "I must confirm the worst," he said, his voice carrying over the anxious gathering. "Mrs. Fortescue is dead. She suffered a blow to the head. Death appears to have been instantaneous. There was blood on the carpet and on a bronze bust from her desk, which I believe was the weapon." His words settled across the room, heavy as snow. Sarah Morrison let out a strangled cry and clung to David, whose face was grim, jaw clenched in silent distress. Charles Fortescue, pale and shaken, had sunk into a chair, hands trembling as he stared at the carpet. Margaret Sims, the young business advisor, stood rigid by the window, clutching her portfolio so tightly her knuckles shone white, her face a mask of professional composure that could not quite hide the shock in her eyes. Inspector Craddock's arrival brought a brisker authority. He surveyed the room, his gaze pausing briefly on each face before addressing the group. "No one is to leave the house until we have taken statements. We must establish the timeline of movements from 4 o'clock, when Mrs. Fortescue returned to the house, to 4:30, when Mr. Fortescue discovered her." The air in the room seemed to thicken with suspicion and suppressed panic. Dr. Haydock questioned Charles first. "When did you last see your aunt alive?" Charles swallowed hard. "About half an hour ago. She and Miss Sims went into the study. I was with the others in the garden until I went in to fetch my cigarette case from the hall. The study door was ajar. When I glanced in, I saw her. She was on the floor, blood on the carpet and the bronze bust beside her. I called for help at once." His words, though halting, carried the ring of truth, but Miss Marple, sitting quietly nearby, noted the perspiration on his brow and the furtive way he avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Margaret spoke next, her professionalism strained. "I left Mrs. Fortescue in the study perhaps 15 minutes before Charles found her. We discussed business matters. She was upset, but alive. I went upstairs to collect my things for my return to London." The inspector made a note, and Miss Marple, ever attentive, wondered at Margaret's careful precision, her apparent eagerness to account for every minute. David Morrison, arms crossed, glared at Charles. Everyone knows Charles was pressuring his aunt to sell the nursery to developers. Helena wouldn't hear of it. Charles bristled. "I was trying to help her out of financial trouble. She was mortgaged to the hilt, obsessed with her roses while the business was failing." "Gentlemen, please," Dr. Haydock interjected. "This is neither the time nor the place for accusations. The police will need to hear from you all." The tension between Charles and David simmered, watched furtively by the rest. Miss Marple, quietly smoothing her skirt, rose and addressed the inspector. "Excuse me, Inspector, but I noticed something on the path between the garden and the house. Several Christmas rose petals, quite fresh, some marked with what looked remarkably like blood." Her tone was mild, almost apologetic, yet her words drew every eye. She led Dr. Haydock and Inspector Craddock to the path where, under the cold moonlight, the petals gleamed white against the gravel. The doctor crouched, examining the stains. "Carried from the garden very recently," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "But why would anyone pick Mrs. Fortescue's prize blooms at such a moment? And how did blood get on them?" Miss Marple's blue eyes were thoughtful. "Perhaps someone wanted it to appear as if the murderer came from or went into the garden. It is curious, too, that the study window was found unlatched on such a cold day, when Mrs. Fortescue was known to abhor draughts." The inspector frowned. "No footprints in the snow outside the window, and no snow inside. If someone used it, they were exceedingly careful." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "the window was opened after the fact to suggest an intruder's escape, by someone who never left the house at all." Back in the drawing room, the villagers' penchant for speculation bubbled to the surface. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "I've always said that nephew was trouble. Did you see his hand? As if he'd hurt it earlier." Mrs. Price clutched her prayer book, eyes darting from face to face, while Sarah Morrison sat rigid, her gaze fixed on her husband. The inspector began organizing interviews, and the guests braced themselves for questions. Miss Marple, settled unobtrusively by the fire, watched the play of emotions and calculated glances, her mind quietly piecing together the first vital pattern in a tapestry of secrets and lies. The morning after the murder brought a crystalline frost to St. Mary Mead, but the village's usual tranquility had been shattered. At the Blue Boar, early customers clustered around the bar with the particular intensity of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. Mr. Pierce, the grocer, leaned conspiratorially toward the publican. "Struck down with a bronze bust, they say. Roman emperor, or some such. Blood everywhere in that study." The publican nodded gravely, polishing his counter with unusual vigor. "My brother's wife heard from the undergardener that Dr. Haydock went white as milk when he saw her. Never seen the like, apparently." The speculation buzzed through the village like electricity, each retelling adding new details and theories about who might have wanted Helena Fortescue dead. Miss Marple, settled in her morning room with her knitting, received Inspector Craddock with her characteristic gentle interest. "I wanted to ask about your observations yesterday," he said, accepting a chair near the fire. "You see things others miss." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she considered his words. "People are so very interesting, Inspector. Yesterday, I noticed Mrs. Fortescue had that particular brightness one sees in someone trying very hard to appear cheerful. Like young Mary from the haberdashers before she ran off with the commercial traveler, all smiles while planning her escape." Inspector Craddock had commandeered Mrs. Fortescue's morning room for interviews, and Miss Marple, positioning herself in an adjacent alcove with her knitting, remained perfectly placed to observe. Margaret Sims entered first, her professional composure brittle as fine china. Mrs. Fortescue summoned me to discuss the financial crisis. She began without preamble. The Christmas Rose business was hemorrhaging money despite its reputation. She had borrowed extensively against the property, and the debts were coming due. Her voice remained steady, yet Miss Marple detected something beneath, a tremor of carefully suppressed emotion. I advised her to accept Charles's development proposal. She refused absolutely, said she would rather die than see the gardens carved up for housing estates. The unfortunate choice of words hung in the air. Those were her last words to me, that perhaps she needed advisers who understood what truly mattered. Charles Fortescue slouched in next, his panic replaced by sullen defensiveness. He confirmed the financial pressures, painting his aunt as obstinately unrealistic. She wouldn't listen to reason about the property's value to developers, he complained, running fingers through disheveled hair. I stood to inherit eventually. Why kill her now when patience would serve? Better. But when Craddock mentioned a letter from her solicitor about revising her will, Charles paled visibly. I knew nothing about that, he insisted, though his eyes betrayed him, and Miss Marple noted fresh scratches on his left hand, as if scraped against something rough. David Morrison entered with controlled tension, speaking of Mrs. Fortescue with genuine respect, tinged with something deeper. She understood plants, understood beauty in ways most people don't. We worked together for 3 years, building something remarkable. Bitterness crept into his voice. Charles wanted to destroy it all for suburban boxes and tarmac. Mrs. Fortescue and I were united in opposing him. When asked about his whereabouts during the murder, he claimed to have been alone in the greenhouse checking heating systems, unable to provide verification. His words carried weight, but Miss Marple noticed how he stopped himself from saying more about his relationship with his employer. Sarah Morrison followed, twisting a handkerchief between restless fingers, her voice barely above a whisper. I was tidying the conservatory after the guests. I didn't see anything until Charles started shouting. Her eyes held desperate quality when she insisted, "My husband is good and honorable, whatever people might think they've seen." The vehemence suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as the inspector, and when she dropped her handkerchief, Miss Marple noticed it was stained not with tears, but with fresh potting soil. During a break in interviews, Miss Marple wandered to examine the coat rack, ostensibly admiring a painting. Charles's wool coat bore a faint greenish smear of crushed plant matter on the right sleeve. David Morrison's canvas jacket carried the scent of earth and something chemical, fertilizer perhaps, while his pockets bulged with what felt like gardening shares. Most intriguingly, a frightened maid whispered to Miss Marple about an earlier argument she'd overheard between Mrs. Fortescue and Morrison in the study. She was shouting, "I know what you've done, David. I won't let you ruin me." And he said, "You can't prove anything without destroying yourself, too." As Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the pieces began forming a complex picture of human passions, greed, pride, fear, and secrets, all blooming as violently as winter roses in the frozen garden of Rosemont House. Inspector Craddock sat in Miss Marple's morning room, his notebook open but his pen idle as he voiced his frustration. The obvious suspect is Charles Fortescue. He needed money desperately, was pressuring his aunt about the property, and discovered the body. Yet something feels too convenient about it all. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, her expression thoughtful. In my experience, Inspector, when something appears obvious, it often means someone wishes us to think so. Rather like Mrs. Clement's nephew who staged that burglary so elaborately that everyone suspected him immediately. The evidence against Charles had mounted alarmingly. A search of his room revealed a letter from a London bookmaker demanding immediate payment of substantial gambling debts. More damning still, Mrs. Fortescue's solicitor had confirmed a draft will leaving Rosemont House and the nurseries to David Morrison, with only a modest annuity for Charles. That alone provides clear motive. Craddock observed grimly. "He inherits everything under the current will. House, gardens, and the valuable Dutch bulb contract worth a fortune if successful." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily. "Charles is a man who avoids confrontation whenever possible. He prefers to wheedle and charm. Striking someone with a bronze bust requires decisive violence that seems contrary to his nature. He might arrange an accident or resort to poison, but direct assault?" She shook her head gently. While the police focused on Charles, Miss Marple had spent the morning gathering village intelligence. At the post office, Mrs. Price had burst with news. "You won't believe what I saw, Jane. Yesterday morning, hours before the party, I saw that London woman, Miss Sims, posting a registered letter. She looked positively furtive about it, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be caught." This detail troubled Miss Marple sufficiently to visit the local library, where Miss Finch kept meticulous records of local history. Rosewood House belonged to the eccentric Mr. Blackwood before Mrs. Fortescue inherited it, the librarian explained. He was a botanist with particular interest in poisonous plants. Mrs. Fortescue had most of his greenhouse specimens destroyed when she started her rose business. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most of them." Miss Finch adjusted her spectacles. "David Morrison saved a few rare specimens. He keeps them in a locked section of the small greenhouse." The revelation sent recognition through Miss Marple. She recalled the chemical smell on Morrison's jacket and his possessive manner when discussing the gardens. More pieces of the puzzle emerged when she encountered Sarah Morrison tending a grave in the churchyard. Not recent, but an older plot marked "Robert Morrison, beloved husband and father, 1950-1985. Sarah looked up, her face ravaged by sleeplessness. "David's older brother," she explained dully. "He died in an accident at the old nursery where David used to work. David never forgave himself, though it wasn't his fault." Her voice carried the weight of old grief. "Guilt makes people do desperate things to protect what they have left." When questioned about her whereabouts during the murder, Sarah's alibi crumbled under gentle pressure. She admitted being in the greenhouse, searching for David. "I thought he might be with her again, the way he'd been so often lately. I couldn't bear it anymore, the way she looked at him, the way he looked at her." The confession revealed the classic triangle of jealousy that had motivated countless crimes. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. "Jealousy is powerful, certainly, but Sarah Morrison strikes me as someone more likely to poison slowly with bitterness than strike suddenly with violence. She lacks the decisive brutality this crime required." Inspector Craddock reviewed his evidence with growing frustration. The unlocked study window troubled him. No footprints in the frost outside, yet someone had deliberately unlatched it from within. The Christmas rose petals scattered on the path, some bearing bloodstains, suggested elaborate misdirection. But why would flowers serve a killer's purpose? Miss Marple examined the study once more, noting disturbed dust on the bookshelves where something rectangular had been recently removed. "Books are wonderfully discreet hiding places," she observed. "One can slip letters or documents inside covers. If someone sought something incriminating, they would look there first." As afternoon shadows lengthened, the case remained frustratingly complex. Charles appeared guilty, but lacked the temperament for violence. David Morrison had opportunity and expertise with dangerous plants, but his devotion to the gardens argued against destroying their creator. Sarah's jealousy provided motive, yet her nature suggested different methods of revenge. "Perhaps, Inspector," Miss Marple suggested gently, "we're looking at the wrong crime entirely. Sometimes murder is merely the visible consequence of something far more complex beneath the surface. Rather like those beautiful Christmas roses. Their blooms are lovely, but their roots grow deep and twisted in the dark earth below." The morning after Inspector Craddock's formal questioning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Young Tommy Bond, the gardener's boy who helped with odd jobs at Rosewood House, stood nervously at her kitchen door, his cap twisted between work-roughened hands. His freckled face bore the expression of someone wrestling with information too weighty for his 16 years. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, "but there's something I saw the day Mrs. Fortescue died that's been eating at me something fierce." Miss Marple invited him in, settling him by the fire with a cup of tea and her characteristic gentle attention that encouraged confidences. Tommy explained that he'd been organizing tools in the shed when he noticed unusual activity around the greenhouse complex during the crucial period when the murder occurred. "I saw Mr. Morrison go into the small greenhouse, the one with the locked section, about 10 minutes before all the shouting started. But here's the odd thing, miss. He came out carrying something wrapped in sacking, and he looked proper upset about it. Not angry upset, but frightened upset, if you take my meaning." Tommy's observation provided the first concrete timeline for David Morrison's movements, contradicting his claim of being in the main greenhouse throughout the afternoon. Miss Marple questioned Tommy carefully about what he'd observed. The boy had excellent recall for details, noting that Morrison had emerged from the locked greenhouse carrying what appeared to be a glass container, carefully wrapped. "He went toward the compost bins behind the potting shed, miss. Stayed there maybe 5 minutes, then came back empty-handed. That's when I heard Mr. Charles start shouting from the house." This revelation prompted Miss Marple to suggest a search of the compost area, where Inspector Craddock's men discovered fragments of a shattered glass jar buried beneath fresh garden waste. The remains bore a faded label identifying it as containing an extract of foxglove, digitalis, from Mr. Blackwood's original collection of poisonous plants. More significantly, traces of the substance were found on garden tools nearby, suggesting recent handling. When confronted with this evidence, David Morrison's composure finally cracked. "She was going to destroy everything," he confessed, his voice hollow with defeat. "Not just fire me, but prosecute me for the missing money. Sarah would have been implicated too. She helped with the false invoices without knowing what they really were. I thought if Helena became ill, had a heart episode, she might be more reasonable about the whole situation." The confession revealed Morrison's original plan: to poison Mrs. Fortescue gradually with digitalis, mimicking heart failure and buying time to cover his embezzlement. He had been adding small amounts to her morning tea for several days, but the dosage had been insufficient to cause more than mild symptoms. "I'm not a murderer," he insisted desperately. "I never meant to kill her, just make her sick enough to be grateful for my care, dependent on me again." But Mrs. Fortescue had discovered his scheme. Her consultation with Dr. Haydock about plant poisons hadn't been for research. She'd suspected she was being poisoned and sought medical advice. When she confronted Morrison in the greenhouse that afternoon, demanding he surrender the poison, he'd panicked and destroyed the evidence. She threatened to call the police immediately, said she had proof of everything, the embezzlement, the poisoning attempts, all of it. Miss Marple listened to Morrison's confession with the sad understanding of someone who had seen human weakness destroy lives before. "The blow to her head?" she asked gently. "That wasn't part of your original plan, was it?" Morrison shook his head miserably. "When I destroyed the poison, she said it didn't matter, that she had enough evidence to see me hanged. She was going straight to telephone Inspector Craddock. I followed her to the study, still trying to reason with her, to make her understand I'd only acted out of desperation." The final pieces fell into place as Morrison described the struggle in the study. Mrs. Fortescue had been reaching for the telephone when he grabbed her arm, pleading for mercy. She'd struck at him with the bronze bust from her desk, but he'd wrestled it away from her. It happened so quickly. She fell and struck her head on the corner of the desk. The bust was in my hand, and there was blood. And I panicked completely. Morrison's panic had led to the clumsy staging of the scene. He'd placed the bust near the body to suggest it was the murder weapon, opened the study window to imply an intruder's escape, and scattered Christmas rose petals on the path to misdirect suspicion toward the garden. I thought if it looked like someone had come from outside, someone who knew about the valuable plants, it might confuse things long enough for me to think of something. Sarah Morrison, when the truth emerged, collapsed into heartbroken sobs. She had suspected her husband's financial irregularities, but had convinced herself they were minor discrepancies, not systematic theft. Her jealousy of Mrs. Fortescue's relationship with David had blinded her to the real nature of their interactions. Not romantic attraction, but the complex dynamic between a blackmailer and his victim. Inspector Craddock arrested David Morrison that evening, charging him with murder and embezzlement. As the police car disappeared into the winter darkness, Miss Marple stood in her garden among her own modest hellebores, reflecting on how the most beautiful flowers could grow from the darkest soil. Morrison's love for his gardens had been genuine, but it had been corrupted by greed and desperation until it poisoned everything it touched, including the woman who had trusted him with her life's work. The Christmas roses at Rosewood House would bloom again, but their beauty would forever be shadowed by the knowledge of what human weakness had wrought among their pristine petals. The arrest of David Morrison brought a peculiar quiet to St. Mary Mead, the sort of hush that follows when a community collectively exhales after holding its breath. At the Blue Boar, conversations returned to weather and local gossip, while the post office buzzed with the satisfied murmur of people who felt order had been restored. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly restless as she sat in her morning room, her knitting lying uncharacteristically neglected in her lap while she stared thoughtfully at the frost-covered garden beyond her window. Inspector Craddock arrived that evening with the weary satisfaction of a man who had closed a difficult case. "Morrison's confession covers everything," he reported, settling gratefully into the chair by her fire. "The embezzlement, the poisoning attempts, even the accidental death during their struggle. The Crown Prosecutor is satisfied we have our man." Yet even as he spoke, Miss Marple detected a note of uncertainty in his voice, the slight hesitation of someone trying to convince himself as much as his listener. "Yes, it does seem very complete," Miss Marple agreed gently, her tone carrying the particular inflection she reserved for statements that were technically accurate but somehow unsatisfying. "Rather like Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning garden, every flower in its proper place, every path swept clean, yet somehow lacking the natural untidiness that makes a garden truly alive." The inspector raised an eyebrow. "You have doubts about Morrison's guilt?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. "Not about his guilt in the matters he confessed to, certainly. But I find myself troubled by certain small inconsistencies, the sort of details that seem insignificant until one realizes they form a pattern." She paused, considering her words carefully. "For instance, Morrison claimed Mrs. Fortescue struck at him with the bronze bust during their struggle, yet he bears no defensive wounds, and those Christmas rose petals scattered so artfully on the path. Would a man in genuine panic stop to gather flowers from the prize circular bed?" These observations prompted Miss Marple to pay another visit to Margaret Sims, whom she discovered still ensconced at the Blue Boar, despite having supposedly concluded her business days earlier. The young woman's professional composure had deteriorated markedly, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain and sleepless nights. When Miss Marple found her in the hotel's small writing room, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, Margaret looked up with the desperate relief of someone who had been wrestling alone with an impossible problem. "I cannot make the accounts balance," Margaret confessed without preamble, her voice tight with frustration. "Morrison admitted to embezzling approximately £300 over the past year, money he claimed to have spent on rare plants and equipment, but my audit reveals discrepancies totaling nearly £2,000. Either Morrison is lying about the extent of his theft, or someone else has been helping themselves to Mrs. Fortescue's funds." Miss Marple settled herself comfortably in the adjacent chair, her expression encouraging Margaret to continue. The missing money was withdrawn through a series of checks made out to cash, all bearing Mrs. Fortescue's signature. But the handwriting analysis I commissioned shows subtle variations that suggest forgery. Not crude forgery, but the work of someone intimately familiar with her writing style. This revelation cast Morrison's confession in an entirely different light. If someone else had been systematically looting Mrs. Fortescue's accounts, while Morrison pilfered smaller amounts for his plant obsessions, it suggested a far more complex web of deception than the gardener's simple tale of desperation and panic. Miss Marple's next stop was Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found the good doctor reviewing his notes from the post-mortem examination. "You know, Jane," he said thoughtfully, looking up from his papers, "there was something about Helena's head wound that has been bothering me." Morrison claimed she fell and struck the corner of her desk during their struggle, but the angle and depth of the injury are more consistent with a deliberate downward blow than an accidental fall. The doctor led Miss Marple through his findings with clinical precision. The wound showed characteristics of a controlled strike rather than the chaotic impact one would expect from a struggle. More significantly, while Morrison claimed to have wrestled the bronze bust away from Mrs. Fortescue, the weapon bore clear fingerprints from the victim, but none from the supposed murderer. If Morrison handled that bust during a violent struggle, there should be evidence of it, Dr. Haydock concluded. The absence of his prints suggests either he never touched it or someone cleaned it very thoroughly afterward. These medical inconsistencies, combined with Margaret's financial discoveries, painted a picture far more complex than Morrison's straightforward confession suggested. Miss Marple began to suspect that the head gardener, guilty though he was of embezzlement and attempted poisoning, might have left Mrs. Fortescue's study believing he had merely knocked her unconscious during their confrontation, only to have someone else enter afterward to complete the deadly work. A conversation with young Tommy Bond, the gardener's assistant, provided another troubling detail. "Mr. Morrison did come out of the study looking proper shaken," the boy confirmed when Miss Marple encountered him near the village green. "But he went straight to the greenhouse after, muttering something about checking on the heating systems. He was there when Mr. Charles started shouting about finding the body, seemed as surprised as anyone when we heard what had happened." The timeline was becoming clearer and more disturbing. If Morrison had indeed left Mrs. Fortescue alive but unconscious, someone else had seized the opportunity to ensure her permanent silence. Someone who knew about the financial irregularities. Someone who had access to the house. Someone who understood that Mrs. Fortescue's death would solve multiple problems at once. Miss Marple's suspicions crystallized when she observed Charles Fortescue meeting with a well-dressed stranger outside the village bank. The man's expensive clothing and calculating manner suggested London connections, and their conversation appeared both urgent and furtive. When Charles noticed her watching, his usual easy charm flickered momentarily, replaced by something harder and more desperate. That evening, as snow began to fall again over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, contemplating the web of deception that had been woven around the Christmas roses of Rosemont House. Morrison's confession had provided a convenient explanation that satisfied the authorities, but the truth was clearly far more sinister. Someone had allowed an innocent man to shoulder the blame for murder, while the real killer walked free, protected by the very thoroughness of Morrison's misguided confession. The Christmas roses continued to bloom in their frozen garden, their pristine beauty unmarked by the human corruption that had flourished in their shadow. But Miss Marple knew that beneath their perfect petals lay roots that ran deep and dark, and she was determined to follow them to their source, no matter how unpleasant the final revelation might prove to be. 2 days after Morrison's arrest, St. Mary Mead had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a solved mystery. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly restless as she sat in her morning room, her knitting needles clicking with unusual agitation. The villagers' satisfaction felt premature, like declaring spring arrived while frost still clung to the garden paths. Something fundamental remained unresolved, despite Morrison's comprehensive confession and the police's evident relief at closing such a complex case. The diary's revelations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Morrison appeared at Miss Marple's cottage door that morning, her face drawn with sleepless nights and her hands trembling as she clutched a small leather-bound notebook to her chest. "I found this hidden in David's workshop," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of her discovery. "He made me promise to burn it if anything happened to him, but I cannot bear this burden alone any longer." David Morrison's diary revealed meticulous records of his embezzlement, but more significantly, it documented his growing alarm at discovering financial irregularities he hadn't created. His entries from the previous month showed mounting panic as he uncovered withdrawals he hadn't made, forged signatures that weren't his work, and systematic looting that dwarfed his own modest thefts. The final entry, dated the morning of the murder, read simply, "She knows about the poison, but someone else has been bleeding her accounts dry. I'm being set up to take blame for everything. Must warn her before it's too late." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with her characteristic calm, though her mind raced through the implications. Morrison had been a convenient scapegoat, his genuine crimes providing perfect cover for someone else's far more systematic theft. When he'd confronted Mrs. Fortescue about the poison, he'd inadvertently walked into a trap that would make him responsible for everything, including, perhaps, a murder he hadn't actually committed. Forensic. Inconsistencies. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, summoned by Miss Marple's urgent message. Dr. Haydock accompanied him, bringing disturbing news from his continued examination of the evidence. "The fingerprints on the bronze bust have been troubling me," the doctor announced without preamble. "They're too clean, too perfectly positioned. Only Mrs. Fortescue's prints are present, and in positions suggesting she held it defensively. But if Morrison wrestled it away during their struggle, his prints should overlay hers. The complete absence of smudges or overlapping impressions suggests the weapon was wiped clean, then pressed back into the victim's hands after death." This forensic anomaly aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicions. She shared Morrison's diary entries, watching as both men's expressions shifted from skepticism to troubled recognition. "Consider," she said gently. "Morrison believed he had accidentally killed Mrs. Fortescue during their confrontation. His confession makes perfect sense if he knocked her unconscious and fled in panic, assuming the worst. But what if someone else entered the study afterward, found her alive but helpless, and seized the opportunity to silence her permanently?" Dr. Haydock's medical expertise proved crucial to reconstructing what had actually occurred. A careful review of his examination revealed something he'd initially missed: evidence of two distinct head injuries. The first blow, to the left temple, caused unconsciousness but wasn't immediately fatal, he explained, consulting his notes. The second injury, to the right side of the skull, was delivered with calculated force while she was already down. That was the killing blow. Deliberate and methodical. The missing evidence. Miss Marple's next insight came from observing what wasn't present rather than what was. Mrs. Fortescue was meticulous in her record-keeping, she pointed out to Inspector Craddock as they examined the study once more. She had discovered both Morrison's poisoning attempts and the systematic embezzlement. She told Morrison she had proof of everything. Yet where are her notebooks, her correspondence with the bank, her documentation of these crimes? A woman preparing to call the police would have gathered her evidence carefully. The absence of any incriminating documents suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Fortescue's filing system had removed specific materials while leaving others untouched. This required not just access to the study, but understanding of what evidence existed and where it would be kept. Morrison, focused on his greenhouse and plants, lacked both the sophistication and the opportunity for such selective destruction. Margaret Sims. Under scrutiny, Miss Marple's attention increasingly focused on Margaret Sims, who had remained at the Blue Boar despite claiming urgent business in London. A discreet, Inquiry to Pemberton and Associates revealed that the firm was conducting an internal investigation into irregularities in several client accounts Margaret had managed. She hadn't been sent to Rosewood House merely to provide business advice. She was there to conduct a covert audit before Mrs. Fortescue could discover the extent of financial manipulation. When Miss Marple encountered Margaret in the hotel's writing room, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, the young woman's professional composure had deteriorated markedly. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain and sleepless nights. "The accounts won't balance," Margaret confessed without prompting, her voice tight with desperation. "Morrison admitted to stealing £300, but my audit reveals discrepancies totaling nearly 2,000. Either he's lying about the extent of his theft, or someone else has been systematically looting Mrs. Fortescue's funds." Margaret's investigation had uncovered a sophisticated scheme involving forged checks made out to cash, all bearing convincing imitations of Mrs. Fortescue's signature. "The handwriting analysis shows subtle variations suggesting forgery," she continued, "but the work of someone intimately familiar with her writing style and banking habits." The timeline. Reconstructed. Armed with Morrison's diary, the forensic evidence, and Margaret's financial discoveries, Miss Marple began reconstructing the crucial timeline. Morrison had confronted Mrs. Fortescue about his poisoning attempts, panicked during their struggle, and fled believing he'd killed her. But medical evidence suggested she'd survived that initial injury, lying unconscious but alive in her study for several minutes before the fatal blow was delivered. During that critical window, someone had entered the room, assessed the situation, and made a calculated decision to complete what Morrison had accidentally begun. The bronze bust had been used to deliver the killing blow, then carefully positioned to support Morrison's assumption of guilt. The murderer had also taken time to remove incriminating documents from Mrs. Fortescue's files, ensuring that their own crimes would remain hidden beneath Morrison's confession. The gathering storm. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, contemplating the web of deception that had ensnared the Christmas roses of Rosewood House. Morrison's clumsy attempts at embezzlement and poisoning had provided perfect cover for someone far more ruthless and calculating. The true murderer had allowed an imperfect but essentially decent man to shoulder the blame for a crime they'd committed, protected by the very thoroughness of Morrison's misguided confession. The evidence pointed inexorably toward Margaret Sims, a woman with the financial expertise to orchestrate systematic theft, the professional access to manipulate Mrs. Fortescue's accounts, and the desperate motive to prevent exposure of her crimes. She had timed her private meeting with Mrs. Fortescue to coincide with Morrison's confrontation, then seized the opportunity his panic had provided. Yet Miss Marple knew that proving Margaret's guilt would require more than circumstantial evidence and logical deduction. The young woman was intelligent and professionally trained, unlikely to confess without compelling pressure. The time had come, Miss Marple decided, to arrange one final gathering, not for dramatic confrontation, but for the gentle, inexorable exposure of truth that had served her so well throughout her long experience with human nature's darker impulses. The Christmas roses continued to bloom in their frozen garden, their pristine beauty unmarked by the corruption that had flourished in their shadow. But Miss Marple knew that beneath their perfect petals lay roots that ran deep and dark, and she was determined to follow them to their source, no matter how unpleasant the final revelation might prove to be. The following afternoon brought another of those deceptively peaceful winter days that seemed to mock the turmoil beneath St. Mary Mead's serene surface. Miss Marple had spent the morning in careful preparation, arranging her sitting room with the particular attention she reserved for occasions requiring delicate psychological maneuvering. The fire burned cheerfully, her best china gleamed on the tea table, and fresh scones waited alongside her famous seed cake. To any observer, it appeared simply an elderly lady's attempt to provide comfort after a village tragedy. The gathering. Inspector Craddock arrived first, understanding from Miss Marple's carefully worded note that this was no ordinary social call. Dr. Haydock followed shortly after, his medical bag suggesting he anticipated the afternoon might prove more stressful than a typical tea party. Margaret Sims appeared punctually at 3 o'clock, her professional composure intact, but her eyes betraying the sleepless nights that had followed Morrison's arrest. Charles Fortescue slouched in last, his usual easy charm replaced by the defensive sullenness of someone who sensed trouble approaching. Miss Marple moved among her guests with practiced grace, ensuring everyone had tea and refreshments while maintaining the gentle, rambling conversation that put people at ease. She inquired about Dr. Haydock's patients, commiserated with Inspector Craddock about the difficulties of winter policing, and expressed motherly concern for Margaret's obvious fatigue. Only someone watching very carefully would have noticed how she positioned each guest. Margaret near the fire, where the warmth might make her drowsy and less guarded. Charles by the window where the afternoon light would illuminate any nervous reactions. The inspector and doctor strategically placed to observe without seeming threatening. The gentle interrogation. "I've been thinking so much about poor Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple began as she settled into her chair with her knitting. "Such a dedicated woman, so meticulous about her records and correspondence. Dr. Haydock, you mentioned she had consulted you about plant poisons recently. Not for research, I imagine, but because she suspected she was being poisoned herself." The doctor nodded gravely. She was quite specific about her symptoms and their timing. Someone had been adding Digitalis to her morning tea in small doses, not enough to kill immediately, but sufficient to cause concerning cardiac episodes. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, her teacup rattling almost imperceptibly against its saucer. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the reaction while her voice remained conversational. How frightening that must have been for her, discovering that someone she trusted was slowly poisoning her. But Mrs. Fortescue was no fool. She would have gathered evidence, documented everything carefully before confronting her poisoner. Morrison destroyed the Digitalis when she confronted him, Inspector Craddock observed. He admitted to that much. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking steadily. But Morrison's diary reveals something quite interesting. He discovered financial irregularities he hadn't created, systematic theft far exceeding his own modest pilfering. The poor man realized he was being set up to take blame for crimes much larger than his own. Charles Fortescue stirred uneasily. Morrison was a common thief who got caught. Why complicate it further? Miss Marple's blue eyes fixed on him with gentle interest. "Because the truth is rarely simple, Mr. Fortescue. Your aunt discovered not just Morrison's poisoning attempts, but embezzlement totaling nearly £2,000. She had summoned Miss Sims from London not for routine business advice, but to confront her with evidence of systematic fraud. Building pressure. The atmosphere in the cozy sitting room grew noticeably tenser, though Miss Marple continued her knitting as if discussing nothing more serious than the weather. Margaret's professional composure remained intact, but tiny stress indicators, a slight tremor in her hands, the way she pressed her lips together, revealed the pressure building beneath her controlled surface. "The medical evidence has been quite enlightening," Dr. Haydock contributed at Miss Marple's subtle nod. Mrs. Fortescue suffered 2 distinct head injuries. The first, consistent with Morrison's account of their struggle, left her unconscious but alive. The second injury, delivered several minutes later while she was helpless, was the killing blow. Margaret found her voice, though it carried a brittle edge. "Surely Morrison simply returned to finish what he'd started? Criminals often—" "No, my dear," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Morrison fled to the greenhouse in genuine panic, believing he'd killed her accidentally. Young Tommy Bond saw him there, destroying the poison and muttering about checking heating systems. He was genuinely surprised when Charles raised the alarm about finding the body." Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for the teapot, her movements deliberate and calm. Someone else entered that study during the crucial minutes when Mrs. Fortescue lay unconscious. Someone who found her alive but helpless and made a calculated decision to ensure her permanent silence. The psychological trap. The missing documents are particularly telling, Miss Marple continued, pouring fresh tea with steady hands. Mrs. Fortescue was meticulous about her records. She told Morrison she had proof of everything, his poisoning attempts and the larger embezzlement scheme. Yet not a single incriminating document was found in her study. Someone with intimate knowledge of her filing system removed specific materials while leaving others untouched. Margaret's cup trembled as she lifted it, tea sloshing slightly over the rim. Perhaps Morrison was focused entirely on plants and gardens, Miss Marple observed mildly. He lacked both the sophistication and opportunity for such selective document destruction. No, this required someone familiar with financial records, someone who understood exactly which papers mattered and where they would be kept. The silence stretched taut as Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable logic closed around Margaret like a net. Inspector Craddock remained motionless, understanding that any premature intervention might shatter the delicate psychological pressure Miss Marple was building with such careful precision. "What troubles me most," Miss Marple continued, "is the bronze bust. Morrison claimed Mrs. Fortescue struck at him with it during their struggle, yet he bears no defensive wounds. The weapon bore only her fingerprints, positioned as if she'd held it defensively. But if Morrison wrestled it away during a violent confrontation, his prints should overlay hers. The complete absence of smudges or overlapping impressions suggests the weapon was wiped clean, then pressed back into her hands after death." The breaking point. Margaret Sims sat frozen in her chair, her professional mask finally beginning to crack under the accumulated weight of evidence and psychological pressure. Miss Marple watched with the patient attention of someone who had seen this moment many times before, the instant when a guilty conscience could no longer bear the burden of pretense. "You had a private appointment with Mrs. Fortescue that afternoon," Miss Marple said softly. "You arrived at the study to find Morrison fleeing in panic and Mrs. Fortescue lying unconscious on the floor. For a few crucial minutes, you were alone with her, knowing she possessed evidence that would destroy your career and send you to prison." "This is all speculation," Margaret whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small evidence envelope. Dr. Haydock found these auburn hairs clutched in Mrs. Fortescue's hand. She regained consciousness briefly before the fatal blow and grasped at her attacker. "The color matches your hair precisely, my dear." The physical evidence, presented with Miss Marple's characteristic gentle certainty, shattered Margaret's remaining composure. Tears began streaming down her face as the careful professional facade finally collapsed completely. The confession. She was going to destroy everything, Margaret sobbed, her voice breaking with the weight of suppressed guilt. "My career, my reputation, my entire future. When I found her lying there unconscious, it seemed like Providence, a chance to solve everything at once. Morrison had already provided the perfect scapegoat with his clumsy crimes." The confession poured out in broken fragments. How she had seized the bronze bust and delivered the killing blow to the helpless woman. How she had carefully wiped her fingerprints while pressing the weapon back into Mrs. Fortescue's hands. How she had removed the incriminating financial documents from the files. "I thought I was being clever," she wept, "using Morrison's guilt to cover my own crimes. But I never anticipated someone like you, Miss Marple, who sees through all the careful arrangements to the ugly truth beneath." Inspector Craddock moved forward with professional efficiency, formally placing Margaret under arrest, while she continued to weep over the wreckage of her carefully constructed deception. As she was led away, the room seemed to exhale collectively, the terrible tension finally released. Aftermath and reflection. Sarah Morrison, summoned by telephone, arrived as Margaret was being taken to the police car. Her face showed not joy at her husband's vindication, but the profound sadness of someone who had witnessed the complete destruction of lives by greed and desperation. "David will be released?" she asked quietly. "The charges will be reduced to embezzlement and attempted poisoning," Inspector Craddock confirmed. "Serious crimes, but not murder. He'll serve time, but he won't hang." As the police car disappeared into the winter dusk, Miss Marple stood in her garden among her own modest hellebores, reflecting on the complex web of human weakness that had destroyed so many lives. Margaret's systematic theft had provided the motive, Morrison's clumsy crimes had provided the opportunity, and Mrs. Fortescue's meticulous nature had provided the catalyst that brought everything to a violent conclusion. The Christmas roses at Rosemont House would continue to bloom in their pristine beauty, but their perfection would forever be shadowed by the knowledge of what human corruption had flourished in their shadow. Miss Marple had seen it all before. The way small compromises grew into larger crimes, the way desperation could transform ordinary people into killers, the way guilt and fear could poison relationships as surely as digitalis could poison tea. "Human nature," she murmured to herself as she gathered her shawl against the winter cold, "remains the greatest mystery of all. Beautiful and terrible in equal measure, like those Christmas roses blooming so perfectly in the frozen ground." The 8th section had reached its conclusion, with truth finally emerging from the tangle of lies and deceptions that had surrounded Mrs. Fortescue's death. Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable methods had once again proven that understanding human psychology was far more valuable than any amount of physical evidence in solving the deepest mysteries of the human heart. The evening after Margaret Sims's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself needed time to absorb the shocking revelation that a respectable young professional had committed cold-blooded murder. The case was officially closed. Justice would follow its proper course. Yet the human cost of the tragedy continued to reverberate through the community like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The inspector's reflection. Inspector Craddock returned to Miss Marple's cottage as darkness settled over the village, finding her as he so often did by the fire with her knitting in hand and a small table bearing the remains of a simple supper. The day's newspaper lay folded nearby, its headline already proclaiming "Sensational Developments in Rosewood Murder Case." "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the familiar armchair opposite her. He looked older than he had a week before, more thoughtful, bearing the weight of a case that had challenged his assumptions about human nature. "But of course," Miss Marple replied warmly. "I always think it is best, after such events, to sit quietly and put things in proper order. In one's mind, you know." He settled himself and regarded her with open curiosity. "I confess, Jane, you had me completely convinced that Morrison was our murderer. Then you began asking your gentle questions about rose petals and fingerprints and missing papers, and suddenly nothing seemed quite so straightforward." Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm as she smiled faintly. "People rarely are straightforward, Inspector. They believe themselves to be, of course, but most lives are made up of small compromises and half-truths. Murder is only the extreme expression of habits that have often been quietly forming for years." Understanding the deduction. "Tell me," Craddock continued, taking out his notebook more from habit than necessity, "when did you first begin to doubt Morrison's guilt?" "Almost at once," she replied thoughtfully. "Oh, I never doubted his wickedness in tampering with Mrs. Fortescue's tea. That sort of furtive, underhand behavior is exactly what one sees in a certain type of weak man. But the manner of Mrs. Fortescue's death was so very direct, so decisive. A calculated blow to an unconscious woman requires resolution and ruthless determination, not the panicked desperation Morrison displayed." Miss Marple paused in her knitting, her blue eyes growing distant. "Morrison's confession told us what he believed had happened, not necessarily what was true. His conscience supplied the details his memory couldn't provide. Yet the physical facts didn't quite agree with his account." "The fingerprints on the bronze bust," Craddock observed. "Precisely. Dr. Haydock's observation about the weapon bearing only Mrs. Fortescue's prints, positioned as if she'd held it defensively, troubled me greatly. If Morrison had wrestled it away during a violent struggle, his prints should have overlaid hers. The complete absence of smudges or overlapping impressions suggested the weapon had been wiped clean, then carefully pressed back into her hands after death. Inspector Craddock nodded slowly. And Margaret Sims? Margaret reminded me of a young woman I once knew who worked as a companion to an elderly lady in Bournemouth. Capable, conscientious, desperately anxious not to slip back into poverty. Such people are terribly vulnerable to temptation when circumstances press upon them. They tell themselves they will borrow for just a little while, and by the time they realize they have become thieves, it is far too late to return to honesty. Miss Marple's voice carried the gentle sadness of someone who had witnessed human weakness destroy promising lives. Margaret had the professional knowledge to orchestrate systematic embezzlement, the opportunity provided by Morrison's panic, and the desperate motive to prevent exposure. Most telling of all, she possessed the controlled, calculating temperament necessary for such methodical violence. The village aftermath. The following days brought the complex process of a community healing from betrayal and violence. Sarah Morrison appeared at Miss Marple's door one grey morning, looking older and more fragile, yet carrying herself with a new dignity born of surviving the worst possible revelations about someone she loved. "David wanted you to know," Sarah said quietly, standing in Miss Marple's hallway with her modest traveling bag, "that he understands why you pursued the truth. He knows he deserves punishment for what he tried to do, but he's grateful not to hang for something he didn't actually accomplish." Miss Marple took Sarah's hands in her own, offering the wordless comfort that often succeeded where speech failed. "Bitterness is a terrible poison, my dear," she said gently. "More dangerous than any digitalist David might have used. Don't let resentment destroy your future as it destroyed his judgment." Sarah nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm moving to my sister's in Devon. A fresh start, perhaps, though I doubt I'll ever look at Christmas roses again without remembering what happened in their shadow." Charles Fortescue had wasted no time in asserting his inheritance, already meeting with property developers about converting the nursery grounds into housing estates. His aunt's life work would be sacrificed for quick profit, the rare hellebore varieties scattered or destroyed in favor of suburban convenience. The village watched this mercenary efficiency with quiet disapproval, understanding that while Charles might escape legal consequences, he would forever be marked as someone who had profited from tragedy. Final contemplations. As winter deepened over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself drawn one last time to Rosemont House. The property stood silent and dark, its windows like unseeing eyes staring out over the village green. In the sunken garden, the Christmas roses continued to bloom with indifferent magnificence, their white petals glowing in the twilight, caring nothing for human tragedies of greed, jealousy, or murder. She paused beside the circular bed around the stone bird bath, where Mrs. Fortescue's prize, Helena's Pride variety, grew in spectacular profusion. Even neglected for days, they remained breathtakingly beautiful, a testament to the dedication and skill that had created them. Miss Marple bent to touch a pristine bloom, thinking of the convergence of human passions that had led to violence in this peaceful corner of an English garden. "Such unnecessary unhappiness people create for themselves," she murmured to the silent flowers. "If only they spent as much effort cultivating kindness as they do nursing grievances, the world would be a very different place." Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple settled by her fire with her knitting, the familiar rhythm of needles clicking in the quiet room. The case was closed, the murderer caught, justice served according to law. Yet the deeper sadness remained, the knowledge that beneath the civilized surface of village life, passions ran as deep and dangerous as anywhere else on earth. She reflected on the complex web of human weakness that had led to Helena Fortescue's death. Morrison's desperate attempts to avoid exposure through poison, Margaret's calculated violence to prevent disgrace, Charles's willingness to profit from tragedy, each had acted from self-interest. Each had believed themselves justified, yet together they had created something monstrous. The Christmas roses would bloom again next winter, their beauty unmarked by the human corruption that had flourished in their shadow. But their perfection would forever carry the memory of what had transpired, a reminder that evil often wears ordinary faces and grows from the most common seeds of human weakness. As the fire crackled softly and the winter wind rattled her windows, Miss Marple picked up her needles once more. Life would continue its ancient rhythms. The seasons would turn, new mysteries would eventually emerge from the quiet lanes and cottages of her village, and she would be there to observe, to understand, and, when necessary, to ensure that truth prevailed over convenient deception. The story of murder among the frozen Christmas roses had ended, but its lessons would linger in St. Mary Mead for years to come, a cautionary tale about the price of allowing greed and desperation to overcome the better angels of human nature. Spring arrived cautiously in St. Mary Mead that year, as if the season itself hesitated to disturb a village still absorbing the shock of murder among its quiet lanes. The daffodils pushed through softening earth with determined optimism, while residents gradually returned to discussions of weather and parish affairs rather than poison and forged signatures. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the community's collective consciousness, a recognition that evil could wear respectable faces and speak in cultured tones. Justice and its complexities. The legal proceedings unfolded with methodical precision through the spring months. Margaret Simms's trial at the Old Bailey attracted considerable attention from the London papers, which delighted in the sensational details of murder, embezzlement, and attempted poisoning in a picturesque English village. Miss Marple attended only the final day, sitting quietly in the public gallery as the jury delivered their verdict of guilty to murder in the first degree. Margaret maintained her professional composure to the very end, though her face had aged years since her arrest. She received life imprisonment, her career and reputation destroyed by one terrible moment of calculated violence. David Morrison's fate proved more complex and perhaps more tragic. Charged with embezzlement and administering poison with intent to harm, he received 7 years' imprisonment, a sentence reflecting both the seriousness of his crimes and the mitigating circumstances of his genuine remorse. Dr. Haydock's testimony that the digitalis doses had been sublethal, combined with Miss Marple's explanation of the panic evident in Morrison's diary, persuaded the court to show mercy. Sarah attended his sentencing alone, her face composed, but her hands twisted together in grief for the man she had loved and the life they had lost to secrets and desperation. The village heals. Charles Fortescue wasted no time converting his inheritance into profit, selling Rosemont House to developers who promised to preserve the main building while converting the gardens into suburban housing. The famous Christmas rose collection was auctioned to collectors and botanical gardens, scattering Mrs. Fortescue's life work across England like seeds on the wind. Charles himself departed for London within weeks, unable to bear the cool civility with which the village now treated him. Money gained through tragedy, Miss Marple reflected, carried its own burdens of social isolation. Sarah Morrison left quietly for Devon before the trial concluded, seeking a fresh start with her sister near the coast. Before departing, she visited Miss Marple one final time, carrying a small box of rare hellebore seeds. "David wanted you to have these," she explained, her voice steady despite her obvious grief. "He said you understood that beauty sometimes grows from difficult soil. Perhaps you can give them a better home than we could manage." Dr. Haydock also contributed to preserving Mrs. Fortescue's legacy, appearing at Miss Marple's door one April afternoon with a potted Christmas rose rescued from the auction. "Helena would have wanted her work preserved by someone who understood what it represented," he said, unwrapping the perfect specimen with uncharacteristic diffidence. Living memorials. Miss Marple planted both the rescued Rose and Morrison seeds in a shaded corner of her garden, working with the patient precision of someone who understood that proper care at the beginning ensured healthy growth later. As she firmed the soil around the delicate roots, she reflected on the complex web of human weakness that had led to such unnecessary tragedy. Morrison's desperate attempts to avoid exposure, Margaret's calculated violence to prevent disgrace, Charles's willingness to profit from others' misfortune. Each had acted from self-interest, yet together they had created something monstrous. Philosophical reflection. On a quiet June evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden as twilight gathered, her knitting in her lap and cooling tea beside her. The newly transplanted Christmas roses had settled beautifully into their new home, their foliage healthy and vigorous despite the trauma of relocation. Come December, they would bloom with the same pristine beauty that had made Mrs. Fortescue's collection famous, a living memorial to a woman whose dedication to beauty had been tragically overshadowed by the greed and violence of those around her. Her nephew Raymond arrived as darkness fell, bringing news from London and his usual affectionate energy. "Another murder solved, Aunt Jane. You really are quite remarkable." Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes twinkling with gentle warmth. "Not remarkable, dear Raymond. Simply observant. People are much the same everywhere. Their passions, their fears, their little deceptions. It's all quite predictable if one pays attention to human nature." "And the Christmas roses?" Raymond asked, settling by her side. "They will continue to bloom," Miss Marple said softly. "Flowers have no memory of human tragedy. They simply follow their nature, seeking light even in the coldest winter. Perhaps there is wisdom in that for all of us." As night descended over St. Mary Mead, cottage lights winked on, one by one, creating a constellation of domestic warmth against the darkness. The mystery of murder among the frozen Christmas roses had been solved, justice served according to law, and the guilty punished. Yet Miss Marple knew that the greatest mystery, the human heart itself, would always remain, endlessly complex and capable of both profound darkness and unexpected beauty. The village slept peacefully under its blanket of stars, its secrets absorbed into collective memory, like ancient stones weathering centuries of storms. And when new mysteries inevitably emerged from the quiet lanes and tidy gardens, Miss Marple would be there, watching, listening, and understanding the eternal complexities of human nature with her characteristic gentle wisdom and unwavering moral clarity. 1 year after the tragedy at Rosemont House, winter returned to St. Mary Mead with its familiar crystalline beauty. Frost embroidered every hedge and gatepost. The village green lay pristine under its sparkling veil, and cottage chimneys sent thin columns of smoke into the breathless air. The events of the previous Christmas had been absorbed into the village's collective memory, transformed from fresh wound into cautionary tale, the sort of story that would be retold for generations, each telling adding new layers of meaning and moral instruction. Miss Marple sat in her comfortable morning room, watching Inspector Craddock approach through her garden gate. His visits had become more frequent since the Fortescue case, drawn by what he called her unique perspective on human nature. She welcomed him with her usual warmth, settling him by the fire with tea in the companionable silence that often preceded their most meaningful conversations. "I've been thinking about that case again, Jane," he began, stirring his tea with unnecessary concentration. "About how close we came to hanging an innocent man for murder. Morrison was guilty of terrible things, certainly, but not the crime we nearly convicted him of. Without your intervention, we would have sent him to the gallows for Margaret Simms's calculated violence." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm. "You would have discovered the truth eventually, Inspector. The evidence was there for anyone willing to look beyond the convenient explanation. That is what I learned long ago. People confess to crimes they believe they've committed, even when crucial details don't match reality." Morrison's conscience filled in gaps his memory couldn't provide, creating a narrative that felt true despite being fundamentally false. The conversation revealed how profoundly the case had altered Craddock's approach to criminal investigation. He had learned to be more skeptical of convenient explanations, to look for inconsistencies even when suspects confessed, to understand that sophisticated criminals could exploit the psychological tendency to accept simple narratives over complex truths. Margaret Sims nearly committed the perfect murder, he reflected, by allowing another criminal to shoulder responsibility for her crime. As they talked, Miss Marple reflected on how St. Mary Mead had gradually healed from the shock of murder among its quiet lanes. The village had processed the tragedy in its own way, transforming scandal into folklore, absorbing lessons about the dangers of unchecked greed and desperation. People had become more cautious about small dishonesties, more inclined to examine their own consciences. Mrs. Price no longer bought lottery tickets, declaring that easy money seldom brings blessing. The vicar's wife spoke more wistfully of honest, modest work, rather than glamorous careers. Even young Tommy Bond had acquired an unusual gravity, as if he had glimpsed something behind everyday life's curtain that could never be entirely unseen. After Craddock departed, Miss Marple wrapped herself in a warm shawl and ventured into her garden. In the sheltered corner where she had planted the rescued Christmas rose and Morrison seeds, pale buds nestled among dark leaves. The mature plant, Mrs. Fortescue's prize, Helena's pride variety, had formed buds of exceptional size and vigor, preparing to bloom with defiant magnificence despite the tragedy that had surrounded its creation. A letter from Devon had arrived that morning, bringing news of Sarah Morrison's quiet rebuilding of her life near the sea. David, now serving his sentence, had been assigned to the prison gardens. He writes that working with the soil again has given him peace, Sarah confided. Plants don't judge you for past mistakes. They only ask for care in the present. It was a small redemption, but redemption nonetheless. The way human beings sometimes found healing through returning to what they loved, even when that love had led them astray. Charles Fortescue's property development had met with mixed success. The housing estate built on Rosemont's grounds suffered from drainage problems that locals attributed, with grim satisfaction, to disturbing the natural systems Mrs. Fortescue had so carefully managed. Nature, it seemed, had its own way of asserting justice. Kneeling carefully beside the Christmas roses, Miss Marple brushed away a light dusting of frost from one perfect bloom. It appeared as innocent as fresh snow, yet she knew the plant contained poisons of its own, rather like certain human virtues that could become corrupted when taken to extremes. Loyalty could become stubborn complicity. Ambition could turn to avarice, and the desire to protect one's position could transform, in rare but terrible circumstances, into calculated murder. Standing slowly, she surveyed her modest garden with satisfaction. The rescued plants had not merely survived, but thrived, their beauty unmarked by the human tragedy that had surrounded their origins. They served as living reminders that dedication to truth and beauty could outlast even the darkest corruption, that careful cultivation produced lasting results, and that patient observation revealed secrets others overlooked. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, cottage lights began to twinkle like earth-bound stars. The mystery of murder among the frozen Christmas roses had been solved, justice served according to law, and the guilty appropriately punished. Yet Miss Marple knew that the greatest mystery, the human heart itself, would always remain endlessly complex and capable of both profound darkness and unexpected beauty. The Christmas roses would continue to bloom each winter, their pristine faces turned modestly downward like parishioners bowing their heads in prayer. They carried no memory of human violence, following only their nature and seeking light even in the coldest darkness. Perhaps Miss Marple reflected as she gathered her shawl against the winter air. There was wisdom in that for everyone, to persist in creating beauty despite the shadows, to remain faithful to one's better nature even when surrounded by corruption, and to trust that truth, like the Christmas rose, would always find a way to bloom, even in winter's deepest cold. With the matter-of-fact air of someone long reconciled to human nature's complexities, Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage's warm light, leaving the frozen garden to its silent watch beneath the winter stars. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure, a testament to the gentle but inexorable power of careful observation, moral clarity, and the patient pursuit of truth that had always characterized her approach to life's eternal mysteries. 2 years after Helena Fortescue's murder, Christmas morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with crystalline perfection. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, transforming the village into a scene from a Victorian Christmas card, every cottage chimney sending thin spirals of smoke into the breathless air. The church bells rang out across the valley with their familiar bronze voices, calling the faithful to celebrate the triumph of light over darkness. A message that resonated particularly deeply in a community that had witnessed both human corruption and ultimate justice. Miss Marple stood at her sitting-room window, watching early churchgoers make their way across the village green. The events at Rosemont House had been absorbed into local folklore, transformed from fresh scandal into cautionary tale. The village had learned to live with its memories, processing them in the particular way that small communities digest tragedy, not by forgetting, but by extracting wisdom from suffering. Raymond West arrived from London that morning, bringing his usual affectionate energy and a manuscript under his arm. "I've written a novel loosely inspired by your case, Aunt Jane," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "Though I've made it much more romantic than reality, I'm afraid. Real murderers are disappointingly ordinary, aren't they?" Miss Marple smiled as she adjusted her hat before the hallway mirror. "People prefer their villains to be obviously wicked, dear. It's more comfortable than acknowledging that evil often wears respectable faces and speaks in cultured tones." She paused thoughtfully. Margaret Sims wasn't a tragic figure. She was simply an efficient young woman who treated a human life like a balance sheet error that needed correcting. As they walked toward the church, their path took them past what had once been Rosemont House. Charles Fortescue had wasted no time converting his inheritance into profit, selling to developers who had transformed the famous gardens into a housing estate. The majestic lawns where the garden party had been held were now scarred by construction, suburban houses rising where the sunken garden had once sheltered its treasures. "All that beauty destroyed for quick profit," Raymond observed with writerly melancholy. "The gardens are gone, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But beauty is resilient, Raymond. It has a way of surviving even when the structures that housed it are destroyed." She led him not directly to church, but to her own garden, where she had swept snow away from a sheltered corner to reveal a sight of breathtaking perfection. The rescued Christmas roses, Mrs. Fortescue's Helena's Pride variety, stood in full, glorious bloom, their pristine white petals luminous against the winter landscape, utterly indifferent to human tragedy or triumph. A letter from Devon had arrived the previous week, bringing news that surprised and touched Miss Marple. David Morrison's exemplary behavior in prison had earned early release consideration, and Sarah had decided to give their marriage another chance. "We've learned that secrets poison relationships more surely than any digitalist," she had written. "This time we'll build something honest, even if it's humble." They planned to open a small nursery specializing in hellebores, honoring Mrs. Fortescue's memory through the specialized knowledge David had gained. Margaret Sims remained imprisoned, her brilliant career destroyed by one terrible moment of calculated violence. She had written once to Miss Marple, not seeking forgiveness, but acknowledging the truth that had been so gently but inexorably exposed. "Prison has taught me what Mrs. Fortescue's gardens might have," she wrote, that beautiful things require patient cultivation and honest care. You see, Miss Marple murmured, touching a perfect bloom with rare tenderness. Margaret Sims destroyed a life to save her reputation. Charles destroyed a garden to fill his pockets, but the roses themselves simply continued to grow. They don't know about murder or greed. They only know that when the days are shortest and the cold deepest, it's their time to bloom. The village had grown wiser, without growing bitter, which Miss Marple considered a rare and valuable achievement. At whist drives and church fêtes, the Rosemont affair returned whenever someone pressed an advantage too hard or spoke slightingly of honesty. "Careful now," Colonel Bantry might murmur. "Next thing you'll be forging checks." Laughter would follow, yet beneath it lay genuine awareness that character could not be safely measured by manners or social standing. As the church bells grew more insistent, Miss Marple took Raymond's arm. "Come, dear, we mustn't be late for the service. After all, today celebrates light coming into darkness, and I think we have more reason than most to understand exactly what that means." Together they walked toward the church, leaving the garden silent behind them. In the corner, amidst snow and shadows, the Christmas roses stood vigil, white, perfect, and triumphant. They bloomed eternally in winter's frozen heart, a testament to truth's patient endurance and beauty's ultimate resilience. The mystery of murder among the frozen Christmas roses had reached its natural conclusion, not with dramatic flourishes, but with quiet restoration of order, patient healing of wounds, and gentle persistence of beauty despite darkness. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she gathered her prayer book, exactly as it should be.